Any kind of consequentialist theory has to have a theory of intrinsic good or basic good. A utilitarian, in particular, wants to either maximize or satisfy, that is to say, I demand the best or I demand something good enough. Well, what do you mean, the best? Good enough? In what respect? You want to maximize or get enough of what exactly? Well, the utilitarian has to answer that question. You need a theory of the basic or intrinsic good. In other words, you're going to be saying that actions, or if you're a different kind of consequentialist, you'll be saying a rule or a policy, a motive, a character trait, a civilization. These kinds of things, well, are good to the extent that they have good consequences. And then you have to say what a good consequence is. Okay, you measure the value of these other things in terms of the value of consequences. How do you judge the value of consequences? That's a question of judging this basic good or this intrinsic good, the things that make consequences good or bad. Well, the moral good then, on a conceptualization like that of any consequentialism or any utilitarianism, is going to say, yes, the moral good consists in producing or having a tendency at least to produce the basic good. But what's the basic good? How do we judge the goodness or badness of consequences? Well, for Bentham and for Mill, the answer is happiness. The intrinsic good is happiness. But what is happiness? How do we evaluate that? There are different conceptions. We've seen Aristotle has a very broad, expansive conception of happiness, thinking of it in terms of eudaimonia, of living well, of flourishing or thriving. And so for Aristotle, it's something that includes all sorts of other intrinsic goods. There are many things that are intrinsically good, but happiness is the ultimate, the final intrinsic good. We always act for its sake and never for the sake of something else. What we're doing basically is always saying, yes, I want this for the sake of that for the sake of this, and so on, until we get to happiness. And then happiness is not sought for the sake of anything else. It's sought only for itself. Bentham and Mill have a different conception of happiness. For them, happiness is pleasure and the absence of pain. That's a view known as hedonism. Pleasure and pain are the only sources of value. Now, why do they think this? At first glance, and a lot of modern philosophers look at this and think, that seems awfully one-dimensional or maybe two-dimensional. Oh, forgive me. Pleasure and pain, that seems like two dimensions. Maybe they're on one dimension. But whatever we say about that, it looks like this is a kind of theory that isn't very complex. Why is happiness just pleasure in the absence of pain? Why aren't all sorts of other things included in it that Aristotle would have included as part of flourishing or thriving? After all, we might think, look, to be happy is not just to feel pleasure, it's not just not to feel pain. It's a matter of all sorts of other more complex states of mind. Having a sense of achievement, for example. Having a sense of self-respect. Feeling like I have some appreciation from others. Some degree of esteem from other people. It might involve a sense of, well, having done the right thing in the past. Being the right kind of person. Having virtues. And so on. Aristotle would have thought it encompasses all of those things. Here, that all gets reduced to pleasure and pain. But it's not a trivial thing. And neither is it quite as reductive as it first sounds. Bentham has an entire chapter where he outlines different kinds of pleasures and pains. And each of the families of pleasures and pains has many different subkinds. So he has in mind many of the things Aristotle has in mind, just he calls them pleasures and pains. But there's something else going on too. Bentham and Mill are empiricists. They think that all of our ideas come from experience. They're basically followers of Hume, and they say all my ideas originate in impressions. But wait a minute, there's something really special about morality. It's normative. It is prescriptive. It is evaluative. I'm not just saying how the world is, I'm saying how it ought to be. And how do I have an experience of that? It's not like I experience how the world ought to be. I see it as it is. And so we've got this problem that Hume points out. We've got a gap between is and ought, between is this way or is that way, and then is good or is bad. And how do we bridge that gap? How do we get from one to the other? Of course, Hume has his own views on that, but for Bentham and Mill, it's like, this is scary. If we're really to approach morality and politics and law and all sorts of other normative areas in a way that exhibits a scientific spirit and takes them seriously and takes them as rational and not just as something that involves sentiment or feeling the way Hume does. We're going to have to say something about what the connection between the is and the ought is, between the is this way, that way, and is good or is bad. We've got to, in some way, explain the origin of our idea of better and worse, of good and bad, of ought and ought not. How on earth are we going to do that? Well, if we're empiricists, we think we've got to find an impression. We've got to find a perception or an experience that is in some way normative, that's evaluative, that doesn't just describe things, but that pushes us back or that leads us toward them. And they both say, what is that kind of thing? Where do I have an experience where it's not just red, blue, square, triangular, but then like, no, or yeah, okay? They say pleasure and pain are like that, okay? You take even a small child, you show them this, show them that, yeah, maybe they're interested, maybe they're not, and so on. But then slap them. They're like, ah! Okay, they don't like it. And it immediately prompts this reaction. It has this effect on action. This pleasure does the same thing. Give the baby something that tastes really, really good. They want more. I was present when the son of a friend of mine tasted salsa for the first time at a Mexican restaurant. And suddenly it was like, more salsa. And so, you give somebody something good, they want more of it. There is this immediate normative impact. It has an impact on desires, on motivations, on, you might say, pulling someone toward or pushing them away from something. And that's not purely descriptive. So Bentham and Mill say that is a kind of perception that actually seems to bridge the gap between is and ought. Pain, pleasure, they actually attract or repel us in a way that other impressions don't. So those are, you might say, distinctively normative impressions. And that's why they take this as a foundation. They see it as the only foundation that is really fully consistent with empiricism. So, with that Humean foundation in the background, they're saying, what else could it be? Maybe there are other states of mind, but really when they talk about pleasure and pain, they mean any state of mind that attracts us to something, any state of mind that repels us from something. And so those are the origins of our feelings of ought, ought not, good, bad, better, worse, etc. Now, Bentham, of course, says, I want you to be clear about what I intend here. This is not a theory that promotes selfishness. We've got to consider not just ourselves, but everyone affected by the action. And in that sense, we have to think about the effects on the entire community. But don't get misled by that. By talking about the entire community, I don't mean anything mystical or hard to define. I just mean making the people in that community happier. The effect on the community is just the sum of the effects on the members. And so promoting the happiness of the community is just promoting the happiness of the people in the community. There's nothing else, nothing over and above that.